now open the floor for questions. Please put up your virtual hand. Actually, no, you won't be able to speak. So we will take questions and answers in the question and answer box. If you can do that, please. Except for the panelists. Panelists can actually ask questions directly. I find this very interesting because there are so many trade-offs that we have to decide on. And it requires supreme wisdom. That's what it sounds like.
Well, I would say collaborative wisdom. I think there is no one that's going to be able to solve this problem on their own. And so we're excited about forums like this because this is where that research and knowledge base needs to come from.
Right. Yeah, thank you. We're very glad to be of service in that regard. I do think that everyone should inform themselves and have an opinion about it. Right, there are a few questions from Helen Drummond of Asaki. Can you explain why a 2-degree global rise translates to 4 degrees in South Africa?
So no is the short answer. This you need to talk to climate scientists about that. And South Africa is blessed with some of the best scientists in the world. But kind of in principle, the average increase for the world obviously means quite a big variation around that average. And South Africa, because it's already quite an arid, quite far south a country, means that we are disproportionately impacted, and it's related to how the thermohalines move from the equator into South Africa, causing high pressure zones and rainfall and cooling effects, as well as Coriolis forcing of cold fronts coming off the Antarctic, which causes the kind of winter rainfall in the Western Cape and Southern Cape. And both of those mechanisms get cut off. So the cold fronts don't quite reach South Africa, which is why you see that increased warming in the Western Cape, as well as decreased rainfall, and the thermohalines from the equator don't quite get as far south, which impacts the high pressure zones. But that's my layman understanding of the principle. So, but the net impact is South Africa warms at higher than average, and also has lower rainfall relative to what might be happening elsewhere.
Right. Yes. When Bob Scholes, the late Bob Scholes, spoke to us a few years ago, he actually claimed that it would be 3 times, that the impact of climate change would be 3 times as much. But I suppose it is an estimate.
Yeah, exactly. And it's also not going to be uniform across the country. So the Western Cape might warm worse than the East, for example. And I think Bob's point was you have to think about the combined impact. So a lot of the modeling also shows that you might have increased rainfall in the east of the country, but because the temperatures are so high, you have higher evapotranspiration. So even though you might have more rainfall, it's still going to be drier. And then there are a bunch of other climate impacts related to prevalence of frost and its role in agriculture, extreme weather like hurricanes. We're starting to see more of that, particularly on the East Coast. And you get some really interesting impacts. So the one example I like to quote is that First Rand had to change where their shipping finance branch was from the West Coast, it was in, I can't remember where, Paternoster or somewhere like that, to the South Coast, because the fishing fleet had to move with the fish. And the warming of the West Coast currents basically forced the fishing fields to the south. And so you have these very dynamic, very complex interactions between climate and environmental systems.
I see. Thank you. That is That is fascinating and very worrying.
Yeah.
Right. The next question is from Jennifer Bowler. Two of the pillars of the Just Transition framework are governance and social protection. That seems to be a comment. From Mfunzo Muvali. Thank you for such an informative talk. Seeing tons of coals being transported to the port of Richards Bay for export, what do you think are the effects of this activity on South African citizens on taking green energy matters seriously, or this shift away from coal?
Yeah, I mean, the core of this debate is really tricky, right? It's really hard to extract from all of what's going on what the key data points are. So, and we tend to get quite a lot of misinformation and cherry picking of data in the discussion. So the one point that kind of particularly vexes me is this idea that the North is returning to coal based on a peak in coal post the Ukraine war. And of course, countries like Germany were stockpiling coal because they were very uncertain about gas supply.
Mm.
And that peak has already come down. So there's no evidence to say the North is returning to coal. It was a short-term measure. And likewise in South Africa, if you visually assess it, there are tons of, truckloads of coal leaving for international markets. And so we get into this very polarizing debate. No one is saying that we must close coal today. No one is saying that we have to build all of the renewables today. Like, obviously, there's this kind of transitionary process. And in fact, we're doing some interesting research with one of the universities to look at what is the impact of that trading of coal on the transition. And it's possible that we as South Africa want to trade as much coal as we can for as long as possible, because it has this buffering impact of the transition on Mpumalanga in particular, because the coal closure schedule is relatively fixed. These plants are reaching the end of the economic life. And if we're able to continue to export coal and maybe even export a little extra coal, then that creates jobs and keeps the coal mines running. And so that's probably something we want to do. But understanding the global coal market and how the market is responding to climate changes is really important. South Africa does have the advantage that the coal that we always export our best things. So it applies to fruit and flowers as well. We export a relatively high quality coal relatively cheaply. So we are in the competitive end of the coal market. And so as the coal market narrows, we will still be competitive, if that makes sense. So again, but I totally hear the point that if you're looking at individual data points, it's very hard to keep track of actually what's happening here. What are our real decisions? What do we need to do? So trying to see the big picture all together is important, but also very difficult.
Right. Thank you, Steve. Dumisa J says, Steve, thank you for the insightful presentation. How then do we budget for such a just transition? Where will all this finance come from? Debt again?
Yeah, so again, a great question. And my colleague, Deepak Patel, leads the climate finance work at the PCC. So he's particularly engaged with that question. There is no question we would need some international support, but the key issue is how do we leverage that international support? And depending on who you talk to, South Africa can achieve a rate of somewhere between 3 and 7 rand per rand invested, or per dollar invested, using local finance. And the South African financial services sector is actually very robust. Consistently, the World Economic Forum rank us in the sort of top 10 most competitive finance institutions in the world. But it's more the banking and insurance sector. So we have very strong banks, very strong insurers. But if we think about the sort of venture capitalists and the private equity funds, they tend to be proportionally smaller than we see in other countries. So there's a need to kind of strengthen the South Africa's financial services sector so that we're able to increase the leverage on that donor and international support. And then there's also a need to strengthen our institutions. So it is challenging, for example, I mentioned this previously, for local government to invest the amounts of money that we need to from a sort of capacity perspective. And so we also need to be strengthening our institutions so that we build the capacity of local government to spend more. And that then will have knock-on impacts on health. There will have to be some debt. I mean, that's kind of how the current financial services sector works. The key issue is how we spend that debt. So it's the same as if we think about a household budget. If I borrow money to buy clothes or food, I'm going to progressively get myself into a worse position. But if I borrow money to buy an asset like a home, I'm going to get generally better. So how we spend that debt needs to be a subject of public scrutiny. We need to make sure that we're spending that debt on building the infrastructure of the country, making sure that it's going to improving rails, to improving roads, to building transmission infrastructure, to building new power infrastructure. And all of those things are enablers to the economy and will attract local capital and build the economy and increase the tax base and get us into a positive cycle on how we build the economy. And that's really what we are hoping to achieve.
Right. Okay. Andrew Donaldson says, Steve, our economy is weak. Savings is low and government finances are in deficit. The rest of the world might lend us money, but they will not make grants to any significant extent. The JP envisages 98 billion US dollars spent by 2027. But in reality, we will be able to afford about 1/10 of this. So how do we move to a realistic plan for the next decade? So that is related to the last question. Have you answered it yet? Or would you like to add?
Well, so a little bit of extra detail. I mean, Andrew raises this really interesting debate that's happening in South Africa. Do we plan for the world that we want, or do we plan for the world we think we're going to get? And embedded in that world of think we're going to get a whole bunch of misinformation and what are we actually capable of achieving? And so, you know, it's a tricky one. I think we've got to be somewhere in between, right? And I do think that we have a much greater local finance capability than to fund a 10th. Like I think a 10th is a little bit pessimistic. I think we can achieve far greater levels of investment than that. The key issue, as I mentioned, is institutions and making sure that we leverage that funding. There is quite a lot of grant. I would actually say that our bigger challenge is our ability to spend the grant that we have, which is linked very closely to this idea of institutional capacity. If we can show that we can spend the grant that we've been offered, then I think there will be more grant. And there are a lot of sort of philanthropic institutions active in South Africa at the moment looking for investment opportunities using grant. But we don't have a very clear pipeline to give them. And so one of the challenges that we face is we need to be able to make sure we have a pipeline of strong investable projects that we are able to share with philanthropists and international donors. And then I think we'll see a lot more grant.
Right. Right. Gosh, one has to be quite a strong optimist. But yes, what you're saying is it is possible, and we shouldn't necessarily think small and limit our thinking to the current situation. Thank you. We have to wrap up in 5 minutes. I just want to read this one about the platinum group metals, and then I'll switch over to the chat questions. John Egan asks, would platinum group metals not benefit from climate transition efforts if a hydrogen economy requires fuel cells or electrolyzers, or would this demand be lower than the current PGM market?
Now, that's an excellent question, and I would say needs a lot more research. Our current understanding of the situation is that, yes, platinum is definitely an ingredient in fuel cells and electrolyzers. Our anticipation of demand is that it would be lower than current demand, primarily because we don't see hydrogen fuel cell electric vehicles making a big dent in the market. Battery fuel cells from a technology perspective seem to be outperforming. They're getting more R&D, they're getting more market share. And we think just from a kind of economic momentum perspective, are more likely to win. They're also a little bit more efficient than a hydrogen vehicle. So the vehicle market for fuel cells, which could in theory be quite large, and Department of Science and Innovation are doing a lot of work with this through the hydrogen corridor. It's a possibility, but sort of balance of probabilities at this stage suggests that battery fuel cells will be more dominant. And so we expect a lower demand. But this is brand new, right? People don't fully understand the hydrogen market at this stage. And even the role of hydrogen and other things like electricity and heavy manufacturing and the sort of electrolyzers that you would need for that, we're only really beginning our journey in understanding that.
Right. Thank you. Lorraine, can't read your full name, Lorraine, says, what is going to happen to our poor performing GDP, taking into account the impact of shifting from carbon-intensive commodities? Is there a plan in place to address this? Let me take the next question as well. Sancha, EUP, says trees require carbon dioxide to live. It in turn emits oxygen for us to breathe. Would we not negatively be affecting and destroying our forests by reducing carbon dioxide in the atmosphere? Science 101 from school teaches us that through a process called photosynthesis, leaves pull in carbon dioxide and water and use the energy of the sun to convert this into chemical compounds such as sugars that feed the tree. But as a byproduct of that chemical reaction, oxygen is produced and released by the tree. Would we not negatively be affecting and destroying our forests by reducing carbon in the atmosphere? Okay, would you like to respond to those two?
Yeah. Just remind me what the first question was. Sorry, the gist of the first question.
The first question was, what is going to happen to our poor performing GDP, taking into account the impact of shifting from carbon-intensive commodities? Is there a plan in place to address this?
Yeah. I mean, this is the core question, right? How do we manage this economic transition? And do we have a plan? We have lots of plans, some of them competing, some of them complementary, as we know in South Africa. So I think we are moving towards coalescing around a specific set of plans. The National Development Plan and their commissioners, the National Planning Commissioners are working on this. The PCC commissioners, the JET IP is going to an investment planning process. So we are moving towards that plan, but I wouldn't say we have one national firm plan yet. Whereas you see in places like the United States, where they have the Inflation Reduction Act, and the EU have their green industrialization strategy, and China have the 5-year plan, they tend to be a little bit more robust in their planning and a bit more directional. And a lot of that is a political question. That slide that I showed, the kind of two sides of the debate, that's a very active debate, and people are not necessarily convinced of either side or not. So no, there's no one plan, but there is a positive direction, is what I would say. Then to the question about trees, so this is an exciting question for me. I trained as a forester many years ago at Stellenbosch University, so know a little bit about trees. There is plenty of CO2 in the atmosphere. So removing, the big issue around CO2 is anthropogenic CO2, so CO2 emitted by people, and that is throwing the system out of balance. So there is too much CO2. So we need to reduce the emissions of CO2 in order to keep the atmosphere healthy, and that would have no impact on trees at all. We would have to reduce it a very long way for it to start having impacts on trees, but also the natural system is in balance. And so you don't need anthropogenic emissions for tree and crop health. I would say, though, that the role of forests is very important and where those forests are located. So deforestation, when we remove trees, is a bigger problem because that is, again, messing with the natural balance of things and reducing the amount of CO2 that is absorbed and the amount of oxygen that is produced, as well as all of the biodiversity impacts that come with that. Trees in South Africa is a slightly different story. So we're an arid environment and not particularly forested. So we have about 1.1 to 1.4% of forest cover. And so there's not a huge gain in planting trees in South Africa because it's not really the natural habitat of our part of the world. But in places like Brazil and Central Africa and Indonesia and the sort of Southeast Asian regions, deforestation and forest health is very important.